for Science on Tap. I'm Jen, and along with Bob, we plan these monthly science educational outreach programs through Science on Tap Cincinnati. We're very proud and thankful for our partnership with Radio Artifact, Urban Artifact, and we're also a member of Community Shares of Greater Cincinnati. Thank you all for being here to learn science and be curious. Thanks for coming out on a cold, I was going to say December. All right, I am in 2024, it's fine. Thank you for coming out on a cold night in That's what it is. It's December weather and no snow. We're just going to be thankful for that. I'm pretty excited about tonight's talk. We scheduled this several months ago, and I'm like, I can't wait because this looks like an interesting one. Michelle from UC Classics is going to talk to us about ancient Greek medical experiments. So welcome, Michelle, to the stage.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me. Can everyone hear me okay? Perfect. As Jen just said, my name is Michelle. I am getting my doctorate in classical philology at UC, which means that when I'm not dressing up like an ancient Greek for Halloween, I am studying ancient Greek and Latin language and literature, and that involves a little French, a little German. It's a whole bunch of different things, which is very cool. But before I was a classicist at UC, I was a middle school teacher. And before I did that, I worked at Mystic Aquarium in the water quality lab, which you can see in the other picture. So the intersection of classics and science has been really important to me for a very long time. And what I'm really excited about for this presentation is that it lets me do both at the same time. So you'll learn a little bit about ancient history, a little bit about science, and we'll look at how the ancient Greeks understood and thought about discovering the inside of the body. All right. So let's start with Hippocrates, our most famous Greek doctor. He was born around 460 BCE, and then his death date is debated, one of the many messy little dates we try to figure out in ancient history. So somewhere between 377 and 360 BCE. He's from Kos, which you can see circled in yellow in the map, but he traveled all over Greece, and that sort of spurred the tradition of itinerant doctors who would travel from city to city while they were practicing medicine. He's associated very closely with Asclepius, the Greek god of medicine, who you can see in the 3rd century mosaic on the other side. Now, when you think Hippocrates, you are probably most likely to think of the Hippocratic Oath. Do we have anyone here in the room who has sworn the Hippocratic Oath professionally? Fantastic! Thank you, doctors. We really appreciate everything you do. Now, you probably were not swearing your oath in ancient Greek. You were likely swearing the modern Hippocratic Oath, which is an adaptation by the fantastically named Dr. Louis Lasagna, who is from Tufts University. Now, there are some shared concepts between the two oaths. There is the promise to share knowledge, respect of patient privacy, and the ethical responsibility most famously represented by the phrase, do no harm. However, there are other parts that were less relevant to modern medicine, such as the promise to financially support the children of your teachers for the rest of your life. That's something that we do indirectly through medical school tuition instead of directly now. When we're reading Hippocratic works in ancient Greek, we are looking at the Hippocratic Corpus, which is about 60 different treatises about different medical topics, written between the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, although some are a little earlier or later, with a wide variety of ideas and styles. And that variety is for a reason. See, we don't know which, if any, of these texts are actually written by Hippocrates. So the historical Hippocrates was a doctor, did probably write medical treatises, but in the 3rd century in Alexandria, when the librarians were assembling the different collected works that they had, they put a whole bunch of treatises together and just called them Hippocratic. But that led to the great Hippocratic question. Which texts are Hippocrates? Which ones aren't? What is the central idea? When are they from? Who was writing which ones? And we've come to realize as a field that that's probably not quite solvable, So we're looking more at what these treatises tell us from an anonymous perspective. Now, over here on the side, we're seeing a handwritten manuscript copy of the Hippocratic Corpus from the 14th century. And the first one right at the top is the Orkos, the oath. So starting with the oath. But here are some of the other titles we'd find in the Hippocratic Corpus. We have very specific anatomical and how the body works treatises, like on anatomy, on the heart, on fractures. Then we have broader how the body functions and how disease functions, like diseases 1 to 4, on diseases of women, nature of man. And then we have the treatises that you wouldn't necessarily expect. Aphorisms are a collection of little phrases and rhymes to help remember medical advice. Think an apple a day keeps the doctor away, but an entire book of these. We have prognostics, so these are advice on how to observe the symptoms of a patient and figure out how their disease is likely to progress and whether or not the doctor is able to be effective, because you don't want to come in, promise you will save someone, and catastrophically fail. That is not going to be good for your reputation as a doctor or the reputation of medicine in general. And then some of my favorite texts are actually the epidemics. So the epidemics 1 through 7, which is a collection of similar works, although not all written by the same person, that are essentially doctors' handbooks. They are notebooks. They are records of, I went to this city, this is what the conditions were like, these are the people I met, these are the diseases they were suffering, how I treated them, and what happened to them. So it's this really cool, granular perspective of what it was like to be a doctor in ancient Greece. Any questions up to this point? Also, I was a middle school teacher. Feel free to interrupt me whenever. Why were they called the epidemics? That's a fantastic question. So it comes from the preposition epe and the word demos. So it literally just means on or among the people, as opposed to, so pandemic, all the people, is a word we're a little familiar with now. But yeah, epidemic is less that it was widespread through everyone and more just the diseases that were happening among this group of people. Thank you. All right. So in this wide variety of treatises, there's also a wide variety of medical approaches. Many treatises look at regimen, so that's your diet, your exercise, recommending taking walks, adjusting what sort of food you're eating. Many of these focus on ideas of different powers, so eating spicy food when you're cold, for example, or trying to boil out a fever. Then there is the more direct pharmacology, applications of specific ingredients, weird concoctions. We have, as an example here, honey and garlic were very popular ingredients, and we know today those did have antibacterial properties, so could maybe even help a little bit. And, of course, surgery for kidney stones were frequently excised with surgery, joints, fractures, being able to reduce a compound fracture and splint it correctly. All sorts of things were being done with those tools. And boy, were they very different tools than we have today. We've got forceps and scalpels and scissors, just like now, missing the very important anesthesia to go with them. And another one that you wouldn't expect to be with some modern application is the cupping vessel. So these heated vessels applied to the skin would create a vacuum and suction as they cooled. So these would be used with bloodletting. But if you don't cut the skin open, you can find them used today. Does anyone remember the Rio Olympics? Michael Phelps and a bunch of the other Olympians looked like they'd been attacked by the Kraken. That's because they were using cupping practices to break up muscle knots for their Olympian feats. We can also see here a vase that has a painting of Achilles splinting a wound on his friend Patroclus. So even as early as the Iliad and Odyssey, people were getting hurt. People needed medical care. great question. What were surgical hooks for? So surgical hooks were used to draw back skin if you were trying to get at something. You could also be using them as a probe, trying to remove something that wasn't supposed to be in there. All right. But let's compare that to how we learn about the inside of the body now. We have 4 different images, and I'm curious if anyone can tell me what is the part of the body and what is the medical imaging tactic being used to get that picture? Yeah. Yes, so we have an X-ray of the chest cavity, we have an ultrasound of an embryo, we have, I believe this one's, yes, that is an MRI of what part of the body? Brain, yeah, we've got the brain from the top. And bonus points, what's the last one? It is nuclear imaging. Any guess the part of the body? Yes. It is a HIDA scan of the gallbladder, and the liver is also visible. I actually had one of these done, although this isn't personally my gallbladder. I had a bit of a disagreement with my gallbladder, but I won. I got to keep it. But when you can't go and just scan the inside of the body, how do you understand it? Well, with the examples we'll be looking at, the doctors were seeing through analogy. They were making comparisons to everyday life. They were observing natural processes outside the body and abstracting those to how they thought those same elements worked inside the body. They were extrapolating from material properties of substances and occasionally constructing experiments to model what they thought was happening in the body. So in this presentation, we'll be looking at experiments from a few different texts, specifically Airs, Waters, Places, which is very environmentally driven. How does the environment affect health? On Generation and On the Nature of the Child are a paired treatise that look at conception and development of the embryo. And Diseases 4 is one of those broad, how does the body work texts. So our first experiment is from Airs, Waters, Places, and this doctor is very concerned to make sure that his audience knows that water from snow and ice is the worst. It is going to make you sick. And his reasoning is that when frozen water melts, the lighter, purer, healthier part of that water is evaporating and getting lost, while the muddier, heavier, less healthy part remains. And he has a demonstration to prove this to his audience. So he suggests, take some water, put it in a bucket, put it outside in the winter. As we know today in the cold, it will in fact freeze. And then bring it inside and melt it again. And if you've measured before and measured after, the water volume will decrease, which he then takes as reasoning that specifically the lightest part of the water has escaped. All right, before we discuss this, can I get a thumbs up, thumbs down? How is this doctor doing on his experimental rhetoric? All right, we've got some division. I love it. Now, for the science-minded, would the volume decrease? Yeah, probably. Not significantly, but over the process of being left outdoors overnight and then heated next to a fire, there is going to be some amount of evaporation. How would the water taste after this process has occurred? Probably not great. Any sort of dissolved solids that were already in the water are going to increase in concentration. There's been lots of opportunity for dust and dirt and soot and gosh knows what to get into it. So, while it doesn't quite prove what's going on, because what this doctor thinks is going on, because that's not quite what is going on, can we see how he got there? Anyone want to resolve or adjust their opinion? Can we get maybe some middling experiments? All right. And to jump to something a little bit even more obscure, a developing child is like a cucumber in a jar. Didn't you know this? So this doctor is trying to explain the phenomenon that some babies, when they're born, are more squished up and little than other ones are. And why would that be? Any hypotheses why that would actually be? Yeah. Maternal malnutrition is a great guess. But the hypothesis that this doctor has is that some women's uteri are just smaller than others, and the baby is going to be squished from lack of room to grow. And to demonstrate the phenomena of a constrained space affecting the growth of something, he's comparing it to cucumbers. And if you have ever gardened and had a cucumber vine near a fence or near the close threads of deer netting, you might have seen this phenomenon where a cucumber gets into a space and then as it grows, it is reshaped by the constraints of its environment. You can buy molds like this and really take advantage of that phenomenon, which is extremely fun. But if you're in ancient Greek, you don't have plastic star-shaped molds. What you are working with is a couple different sizes of vessel. And if you place a growing cucumber into a cup without separating it from the plant after it has already been pollinated, it will grow into the shape of that cup. In a larger jar, it will grow into the shape of that larger jar, or if it's a big enough jar, into a normal cucumber shape. Does this explain how babies work? Not quite, but can we give him points for trying? Yeah. It's a start. It is making the conclusion, or making the assumption that how something works outside of the body can be an effective model for what's happening inside of the body. It's a little bit of trouble with what is an appropriate analog, but it is at least looking for an analog, and I think that's worth appreciating. And for our next experiment, we really do need an analog. And in fact, we need a moment to discuss the theory that we're even trying to model. So, in Diseases 4, we are looking at an idea of how the body works that is very based on humoral flow. You might be familiar with this from medieval medicine. It actually originated with the Hippocratics, but it's a great example of the inconsistency of the Hippocratic Corpus. There is, in fact, only one treatise that has the same 4 humors that the medieval medicine has, with black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm. Here we are close. We have blood, which is associated with the heart, phlegm associated with our head, water in your spleen, and the part by the liver, our gallbladder, is our source of bile. Now, this doctor believes that the belly and the food and drink within it is the source of all of these humors, and that these 4 fonts both draw material they need from the coila, from the stomach, and then release them back if they have an excess. So that is the statement we are trying to prove, the system of flowing back and forth depending on need. And the reason for that is that the body is just built to maintain this appropriate balance of humors. Diseases happen when these humors become unbalanced. So how do we demonstrate this? Well, you get some bronze vessels, and you drill some holes in the bottom, and you connect them using little pipes. And then this doctor is very focused on making sure that your vessels are on very level surface, that your pipes are sealed very well, very much keeping in mind the material constraints of this experiment. Then you pour water into one vessel, and you will find, through the principle of communicating vessels, that the water will flow across and the water level will rise equally in all of them until they're all filled. If you remove water from one vessel, the same process will occur again. So, we do know that humors are not how the body is working now, but would we consider this an effective model of how the humors are working? I'm seeing some ish. What's a principle for this doctor's system that's really missing in his model? Cart before the horse, how so? Yeah, so definitely very theory-forward experimenting. We're missing our hypothesis. We're not giving space for the theory to be wrong. All right. Now, I was able to get through a little quicker than I normally do with middle schoolers, so I am going to skip past my final slides, and I have one more experiment in reserve. So, we've modeled the body, we've modeled babies as cucumbers, and decided that's not a great analog. Let's try a better one. There we go. Let's compare them to chickens. I mean, it's a step up. So the premise in this author, and this is back to The Nature of the Child, is that a key part of the development of the embryo is the movement and effect of breath. So that breath gets into the embryo through the umbilical cord, and as the breath interacts with the heat of the womb, it creates a membrane. These are very significant ideas for this author, and he goes to a lot of effort and includes a lot of experiments trying to demonstrate how this is happening. So, the statement here is that you can observe these features in developing chicken eggs. And the reason, here we do have an author who is thinking about the appropriateness of their model, is that chicken and human development is similar, at least as far as one can compare the growth of a bird to the growth of a human being, recognizing this isn't a perfect match. So what you do is you set 20 or more eggs under 2 or more chickens to be hatched all at the same time, so that each successive day you can take an egg, crack it open, and observe the progressively developing embryos. Now, the author very much specifies that you will see the membrane and the umbilicus. There are a lot of different things you can see in the development of a bird this way, but they want to really focus the audience's attention on these 2 key features. Now, the next slide actually has some pictures of this experiment being done, because it is still performed in modern developmental biology classrooms on occasion. If you are a little squeamish, I would maybe close your eyes, but otherwise, here we are. Do we see some membranes? Do we see an umbilicus? Which day is the best view of the umbilicus? Sorry, I'm hearing voices but not quite catching numbers. Yeah. 10 and 11 and 12 are definitely our strongest candidates for observing that umbilicus connecting to the yolk, and we can see the membrane in quite a few of these. So, we finally maybe earned a thumbs up on our Hippocratic experimenting. Somewhere in there. So what can we learn from these experiments? And I will back up. Different tools, same objectives. The objective of learning about the inside of the body. Now, the idea of a hypothesis has not really been developed yet. They're not really thinking about the possibility that they're going to be proved wrong through these experiments. And they're not quite making the same distinctions about what is or isn't an appropriate analog. But making that leap that you can observe something outside of the body, that it's even worth trying to model a process independent of the rest of the system it's connected to, is a huge intellectual leap, and one that deserves to be valued. And I think it's really cool that we have these texts so that we're able to peek back into this very early stage of the process of scientific experimentation and see just how it was getting started and where it developed from there. So, thank you. Any additional questions? Yeah. Did the Greeks dissect humans is a question that actually depends on what time period you're looking at. So in the period of the Hippocratics, they were not dissecting humans. There is one experiment described of a pre-Socratic who maybe was looking at eyes, but it's like a very short statement, it probably is he pulled an eyeball out of something and noticed that there was a connection to the brain. But in Alexandria, around the same time as when the Hippocratic treatises were getting collated, there were scientists who were performing dissection and vivisection of humans, and that led to some really impressive developments in the discovery of how the pulse worked and circulation of blood. Yeah. Yeah, so the question is whether without the concept of hypothesis, which is, I'll admit, a very broad generalization of scientific thinking and epistemology, how could they not do an intervention, like have a system and then be trying to see how it changes? Yeah, that idea of cause and effect, and if I did this, would that happen? I would say that if I did this, this would happen is still very present. If I put the cucumber in the jar, it is constrained, but it has less room for that negative, for the null hypothesis to exist, I think. Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right, so the question is there a concept of a control group? And not really. Typically with the descriptions of the experiment, you don't even see replicates as a concept. I think the closest is that cucumber in a jar, because there's both the small jar and the small jar and the big jar, and seeing how that affects the growth of two different cucumbers. That's about as close as we get. Yeah, back there. All right, so your question is sort of how were people learning from each other and to what extent was that possible? Right. Cool. Yeah, so in some ways, yes, there is this very limited spread of information, but actually in the medical field, there was more exchange of ideas than you might expect. Part of that is because the doctors were traveling around so much and you were learning from each other. Also, being a doctor, a Hippocratic doctor, was only one of the ways that you could provide medicine. So within the Hippocratic Corpus, there are competing theories of how the body works. But if you were a sick Greek person, you didn't have to go to a Hippocratic doctor. You could go to a healing temple. You could go to a root cutter. You could go to someone who's called a magoi, sort of a wonder worker. And all of those were considered valid ways to treat your illness. So there are some of the pieces in the Hippocratic Corpus that are not so much instruction manuals, not so much explanations, treatises to be read, but display pieces to be performed in public, like presentation speeches. And that's one of the ways that ideas would be spread, is this sort of rhetorical competition of different medical ideas. Great question. Yeah, back there.
We'll see if that's needed. I'll use it anyway. My question is about the aphorisms and just my experience of long ago learning about the philosophers and the Greeks. They really liked rules. They really liked aphorisms. They really liked them to make sense universally, and that was a very present concept. And I'm wondering about these experiments and if they had to keep in line with the aphorisms, or if they went against them, were they even allowed to talk about that? Or was that the purpose of the epidemics, to say this is the what of what I'm seeing, and now my experiment will prove, I don't know, the how. So I wonder about the relationship there between the aphorisms and their findings, I guess.
That's a great question. I think the way that I would say it is that the aphorisms were not some superior system within it. So some people might use the aphorisms. A lot of them support a lot of general principles that are going to be fairly compatible with a couple different ideas of the body, both the humoral flow and some more general heat, cold, wet, dry principles. But yeah, it's not something that was viewed as a grand authority that anyone would even think to challenge specifically. Good question. Yeah.
Yeah, in the writings, do they discuss either cause or treatment for some of the common diseases of the time? Things like dysentery, cholera, those types of common.
Yeah, some of the treatises absolutely talk about the origins and treatments of diseases. Diseases 4 is one of the texts that does that, and they're explaining all of the origins of diseases based on these imbalances of humors and how those can be adjusted through combination of different therapies, heating, cooling, different medicines that can be applied. And different doctors and different treatises have different ideas for why those diseases were happening, and therefore what was the appropriate way to treat them. So,
I realize they don't know about gradations of excellence, but did they get any better insight than the failings of the Middle Ages? Not heavily.
did they have better insight than the Middle Ages? I will admit, I don't know a whole bunch about medieval medicine, so I would be guessing on medieval. I think some of the practices make more sense to modern science than others when the understanding of the body is so diverged from how we currently understand the body. It is more difficult to say. The things that align the most closely are the healing of broken bones. Yeah, I think I saw a hand over there.
Yeah. Ooh, I get the microphone. Oh, special. So one of the things I've oftentimes studied is Roman surgeries and medical practices. How much do these overlap? I know the Romans took a lot of information from the Greeks just a few hundred years later. Did they still overlap quite a bit with Roman stuff?
Yeah, are you thinking largely of Galen?
I'm thinking mostly the surgery stuff. I know
Okay.
that like a lot of the tools that surgeons used in ancient Rome, I mean, can be very quickly compared to what we use today. Maybe obviously we've got far more advanced stuff today, but some of the more basic stuff like the scalpel and things like that were oftentimes used in Rome. I was just curious, how much did ancient Rome overlap with ancient Greek medical practices?
Yeah, they definitely engaged really closely with the Hippocratic Corpus. Galen, the doctor that I was mentioning, he actually wrote extensive commentaries on Hippocratic treatises, and he was one of the people who was very concerned with identifying the genuine works of Hippocrates as opposed to the extras that just sort of ended up in the corpus during the Alexandrian period. Now, to be fair, the way that Galen was making that determination was that the real Hippocratic treatises were the ones that agreed with what he thought was going on. But yeah, he was very involved in dissection and in a much more surgical approach to the body, but he was very heavily influenced by the Hippocratic system. And Hippocratic Corpus does maintain influence well, much farther than you would expect, even in the medical school in Padua. They were still using the Hippocratic Corpus alongside some of the more modern medical treatises in the time of Vesalius, which I think gets back to your question about medieval medicine. But that is, we are getting into a narrower range of how well I know the material. Any other questions either about this presentation? I'm also happy to answer questions about what it's like to be a grad student, science, fish, all over the place. What? What made me go back to school? I was I love teaching middle school. Middle school is wonderful. But I really enjoy research, and I was excited about the opportunity to pursue projects in more depth than I was able to while teaching. So I do study Hippocratic medicine. I am finishing up coursework and about to start my dissertation, which will focus on Pliny the Elder's Natural History, which is an encyclopedia of the entire natural world. For what exactly I'm going to say about it, wait a couple years and come back to Science on Tap. Yeah. I taught middle school Latin. I also taught technology and a section of earth science. I do still teach Latin. I taught intro my first year, intermediate the next year. I taught a Greek and Latin roots of scientific and medical terminology class. Yeah, they do. It is a very relevant thing to keep learning. It is incredibly helpful for vocabulary, grammar, literature, and it opens up a whole world of things to learn about. There are lots of Latin texts that are available in translation, but lots that also aren't, especially if you're interested in medieval Latin. You really need to learn the original. Yeah. Well, I will say thank you so much, and I will also put a little plug if you have a high schooler in your life, especially one who is interested about the ancient world. UC is a wonderful place to learn about classics and all sorts of things. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you all for coming. For those of you that are new, I see some new faces in the crowd. We do this first Wednesday of every month. You can follow us on Facebook and on Meetup, Science on Tap Cincinnati. These events are live streamed and recorded on Radio Artifact's YouTube and Twitch channels if you want to go and look at our past events. I will be posting February's event sometime in the next week or two. I'm traveling next week, so no promises. We are a volunteer organization. We are looking for some volunteers to help with social media and getting the information out. A lot of us are diversifying our outlets of where we get our information. So we want to get as many people as possible on multiple platforms, and that's sometimes hard to do. So if you're interested in that, or if you have suggestions on speakers or topics, let me know. I'll stay for a few minutes afterwards. Thank you all for coming, and I hope to see you next month.